Hello, welcome to week 3, SUNY History of Jazz, Special Topics, Humanities, 610. This is going to be a discussion, briefly, of Sidney Bechet, another luminary, another important figure in early jazz, and an important figure as a soloist who, alongside Armstrong, in fact, in some ways, kind of before Armstrong, though concurrent, helped transition jazz from essentially a collectively improvised music to a soloist-centric improvised music. Soloist plus accompaniment. So, a little bit from Swed's Jazz 101, Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Jazz. As I have said, for all these videos and for our course, we are referring to this excellent primer, and I encourage you to check out John Swed's remarkable work. His writing on Sun Ra and others is singular. Okay, so a bit about Sidney Bechet. Why are we talking about Bechet? This is the second major figure in week 3 that I want to touch on, Louis Armstrong being the first. Are we only talking about Bechet because he is a exhibit B, sort of, to the most important soloist voices of the early jazz, who moved the music away from collective to soloist focused music? Not only because of that, but perhaps to re-emphasize, or to emphasize, and then I will re-emphasize later, that as much as I celebrate Armstrong, and we all should and do, there are other important figures as well. It's easy to, in a sort of a sweeping discussion of so many important figures, to lionize a few. And by necessity, we are doing that in this course as an introductory course. And yet, and in fact, not just in introductory jazz courses, but really in the discourse of jazz history and the presentation of its lions and its central figures and all of the above. Armstrong, Ellington, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, these names are known to people who don't know about jazz because of their outsized influence, but also because of the nature of the way historians, critics, other musicians, the way the individual figures end up kind of shorthand for, oh, well, that's, how did the music go from being collectively improvised to being a soloist music? 2 words, Louis Armstrong, and yes, that is true, but again, so none of this is to give Bechet short shrift, but it's to contextualize why I'm talking about 2 figures essentially up to similar things, at least early on in their careers, and yet with some salient differences. So, a bit from Swed's Jazz 101 about Sidney Bechet. If there was one reed player in Armstrong's league, it was fellow New Orleans clarinetist and, as we know him better, ultimately soprano saxophonist, Sidney Bechet. In fact, Bechet's style was developed even before Armstrong's. Yet, because he played the soprano saxophone, then a rather arcane instrument, still one, frankly, although much less so, much more common, and spent much of his life in Europe, as in working in Europe, and we'll discuss that moment as well, his influence was never nearly as great in the United States as Armstrong's. Starting as a clarinetist, Bechet played a highly decorative and detailed line like most other reed players from New Orleans, but he was a far more accomplished musician than other clarinetists, and his solos moved with surprising rhythmic freedom for the time when, early on, he switched to the soprano saxophone. His playing became louder. Saxophone is louder than a clarinet by nature, as well as the individual playing it, but the instrument itself is more declarative, right? And he began to dominate the groups he played with, much like Armstrong did. But it was his sound that was most striking, his vibrato, as in the way that a aerophone player, primarily a brass player or a wind player, an instrumentalist dealing with breath, the way they warble their tone when they produce sound that goes to the air column, comes out whatever sounding source at the bottom or in the front or whatever the instrument may be. Any breath using instrument to produce its tone, you can play with vibrato and vibrate the tone. You can play without, and there's a real range of approaches. His vibrato was striking. It was intense. It was fast. It was, quote, hysterically wide and throbbing, right? This wide vibrato. Powerful vibrato, matching his elaborately decorated melody lines and giving an expressive charge to everything he played. Okay, all of that is saying his tone, the sound that he produced on the soprano saxophone, most signature, most signatorially. Clarinet as well, but we know bechet really as a soprano saxophonist ultimately. The sound he got was rivaled this power and scope, let's say, that Armstrong produced on whether he was playing the cornet or singing. A couple important notes that Swed points out: the fact that bechet played a less readily identifiable instrument at the time than Armstrong contributes in some ways to not the footnote status that he holds, because he's not a footnote. Bechet is a central figure in the early jazz, but the fact that he did not play the instrument that we associate with in the front of the band, yes, saxophone, but not the soprano saxophone, and not in the 20s, the teens, in fact, in the 20s and the 30s when bechet was working. It was a curiosa. It was a strange instrument to find. In fact, it wasn't really popularized until John Coltrane in the 1960s, and ever since, the soprano has always had this sort of, oh, well, I'm a tenor saxophonist and a soprano saxophonist, or I play a handful of saxophones, the soprano amongst them. Only really a handful of individuals are sort of soprano saxophonist, period. Steve Lacy. The list is short. It's often a double. Bechet, most importantly. In fact, the reason why Steve Lacy, who we'll touch on later in the semester, picked up the soprano saxophone in addition to hearing John Coltrane was also because of his love for early jazz and for Bechet's sound. So the fact that Bechet played this less than easily identified soloists, primary jazz focused instrument, accounted for him sort of not being as, because we just got done with saying that Armstrong is the central figure not only in jazz but in American music ever, right? More or less on the short list. Bechet maybe is not quite in that rarefied company, but here we're parsing why, right? He played a somewhat unusual instrument, and also he lived and worked in Europe primarily. For when he left New Orleans, for the most part, he worked. He lived in Chicago, he lived in New York, probably a little bit, not probably, briefly a little bit. But the point is, the bulk of his work was actually made as an expatriate. And the thing that happens historically, when we'll see this, other important jazz musicians, very often African American jazz musicians, early on, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and in fact ever since, found Europe to be a more hospitable place to live and to work due to the strained nature of race relations in America in the 20th century. And this is a very important point. We're not just talking about music in this course. This is a history of jazz, right? And it's, again, a primer, really. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about the music in the context that it exists. So for African American musicians in the early 20th century, whether in New Orleans, whether in other cities in the urban South, whether in the cities that African American populations migrated to, Chicago, New York, also Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles, etc., right? Where race relations were fraught. They still are. We know this, unfortunately. We are not living in a post-racial world. We know this sadly, right, from the state of America in 2018. However, we're talking 100 years ago, things were quite different. And so it was much more hospitable for Bechet to live in Europe and work. There was more opportunity. He was lionized. And in fact, African-American musicians were lionized in Europe. Europe very early recognized the power of the new music from America, the new popular music from America, its rhythmic vitality, its improvisational daring, its harmonic and melodic sophistication, its different formal organizations, all of the above. It recognized how great this music was. It took the world by storm, right? It took Europe by storm, and so many musicians like Bechet, Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon, many other singular figures made much of their career, continued much of their career while being based in Europe because of the realities of it being a better place to live. Armstrong did not. He toured the world incessantly, but unlike Bechet, he stayed in America, and worked as we said, again in popular forms in entertainment and radio and film, as a State Department musician touring on behalf of the United States. Bechet did not have the same panache as a popular figure necessarily. And yet I keep saying this to emphasize his importance, that despite some of Armstrong's next level sort of popular gains, musically they were very much dealing from similar places, albeit on different instruments. A bit about then the example of Bechet's playing that we have on the Week 3 playlist from Swed's text. This is about Bechet's interpretation of the George Gershwin song Summertime. Summertime, we all know this song, or many of us do. Bechet's interpretation is radical in its way for several reasons. It says, when this Gershwin song was recorded in 1939, Bechet was committed to keeping certain principles of New Orleans jazz in front of the public. But by choosing a song not in the New Orleans repertoire, he showed that he was no mere revivalist. The intensity and passion he brings to the song exceed almost any New Orleans performer's abilities. It says, except Armstrong's, i.e. he and Armstrong were the only ones in a way who could bring that kind of vividness to their solo statements at the time. There is a careful choice of notes at work here, but also a luxuriousness and beauty that is rare in any music. Okay, not much in that last statement for us to parse, perhaps, but it is important to note that we are listening to Bechet in 1939 here, decades after his work has already been, has developed, his voice has developed for decades. What was going on in the 1930s? Many other developments in jazz, as we will get to next week and beyond. We leave the jazz age, we get to the swing era, etc., and then to bebop. But here's Bechet working in 1939, not just because another movement that's happening, or not really a movement, sort of a stasis, if you will. What was happening at the same time that other movements were beginning in jazz as jazz left New Orleans there was also traditionalists and revivalists and people who continued the New Orleans style, so to speak, outside of New Orleans around the world. In fact, there are European traditions of Dixieland music, of trad jazz in Britain at this time. Traditional, sort of forms being adhered to, and sort of, for even in 1939, for traditionalists and revivalists, Armstrong's daring was still too daring or something. Same with Bechet. There is also an important racial element to the fact that Bechet in 1939 is saying, I am a New Orleans soloist. Still, I'm not a swing band soloist, as we will see other figures later than him are. I am not a modern jazz musician in any way, as the early bebop stylists of 1939 began to be. No, he is a New Orleans player, and yet he's not only playing in New Orleans style. He's not even playing a piece that was from the early 20th century. He's playing a song of Gershwin's that also was repurposed as a bebop tune and as many other sort of later forms of jazz kind of soloist vehicle. He's no mere revivalist, Bechet. He has the same force of personality in his improvisation because of the musical strength of what he's doing, because of, again, as Swed identified with Armstrong's solo in West End Blues, because of this combination of architecture in his solos that is impervious, right? That you can't knock it down. It all makes perfect sense if you analyze it and look at his construction, right? The building plans are up to code, so to speak, beyond up to code. They're the model of what code should be. And yet, at the same time, he brings a visceral quality, this massive control of vibrato, hysterically wide and throbbing at other times, intense and fast, as Swed points out, right? Elaborately decorated melody lines like New Orleans soloists do. He ornaments his lines. So he's both a New Orleans player and timeless. And just like Armstrong, Bechet is as modern as he is a traditionalist. He is as daring as he is always coming from the past. So why are we listening to Bechet this week? Well, to restate, because Bechet's singularity is in fact analogous to Armstrong's, in that there was not just one soloist who moved the music from being collectively improvised to being soloist plus accompanist. Here's Sidney Bechet doing the same thing as Armstrong, more or less concurrently, right? In fact, a little before, he's a bit older, but really along the same time for decades. Okay, so Sidney Bechet, Summertime.